The rental car's tires crunched over gravel that hadn't been maintained in months, maybe years. James Reed squinted against the autumn sun cutting low across the Indiana horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The dashboard clock read 4:37 in the afternoon. 15 years since he'd last seen this place. 15 years since his parents had loaded up their sedan and driven away from the Reed farm, convinced that the city held better futures than dirt and crops in the endless cycle of seasons. Now at 27, with a graphic design degree, gathering dust in a cardboard box, and termination papers from his Boston firm still crisp in his jacket pocket, the irony settled on him like the fine dust coating the car's windshield. The city had chewed him up and spat him out, just like it had done to his father. And here he was, crawling back to the place his parents had been so eager to escape. The farmhouse needed paint. White clapboard siding had weathered to gray in patches, and the porch railing showed signs of rot near the steps. The red barn stood behind it, leaning slightly to the left, the way old buildings do when their foundations shift over decades. Fields stretched endlessly under an October sky streaked with high, thin clouds. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if the whole property had shrunk in his absence, or maybe he had just grown too large for it. James cut the engine and sat in the silence that rushed in to fill the space. No traffic noise, no sirens or subway rumble, or the constant white noise of city life. Just wind moving through dried corn stalks in the distance and the tick of the cooling engine. He could hear his own breathing. When was the last time he'd heard his own breathing? The inheritance letter crumpled in his hand as he gripped the steering wheel. 6 months. The will required him to live here for 6 months before he could make any decisions about the property. His grandfather Raymond had been specific about that. Not 5 months, not a visit here and there. 6 full months of residence before James could choose to keep the farm, or sell it, or do whatever young men do with land they never asked for. Movement caught his eye. A pickup truck, blue and rusted, speeding away from the back of the property, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the service road. Strange, he wasn't expecting anyone else to be here. The lawyers had said his uncle Max was managing the property temporarily, but they hadn't mentioned anything about vehicles leaving in a hurry at dusk. James shouldered open the car door and stepped out. The October air hit him, cool and clean, smelling of turned earth and wood smoke from somewhere distant. He pulled his duffel bag from the back seat. Everything he owned that mattered fit in one bag now. The rest was in a storage unit in Boston, waiting for him to decide if he'd ever go back. The farmhouse door swung open before he reached the porch steps. His Uncle Max appeared, filling the doorframe with his bulk, face already twisted with something between displeasure and resignation. Max had been living here since Raymond died 3 months ago, managing the property while the lawyers sorted through the complexities of the estate. His work boots were caked with dried mud, and James could smell cigarettes and motor oil on his clothes even from several feet away. The same scent he remembered from childhood visits, when Max would ruffle his hair with rough hands and tell him stories about the farm that always ended with someone working harder than city folks could imagine. "So you actually came?" Max's voice carried across the yard, flat and accusatory. "Figured you'd just sell from the city like all the other inheritance brats. No need to get your hands dirty when you can sign papers from a lawyer's office." James adjusted his grip on the duffel bag. "The will says I have 6 months to decide. Thought I'd spend some time here first. See what grandfather left me." Max spat into the dirt beside the porch steps. "There's nothing for you here, kid. This place needs work. Real work. You city folks don't understand." He gestured toward the barn with a calloused hand, fingers thick as tool handles. "That old building's ready to fall down. Tractor's busted. Winter's coming. You'll be back in Boston before Thanksgiving, tail between your legs." Something in his tone made James want to prove him wrong, made him want to stay just to see the surprise on his uncle's weathered face. But he said nothing, just nodded and moved past Max into the house, feeling the older man's eyes on his back like a physical weight. The farmhouse felt hollow without Raymond's presence. His grandfather's coffee mug still sat by the kitchen sink, a ring of dried coffee staining the bottom. Worn flannel shirts hung in the bedroom closet like ghosts of a life James had only glimpsed during summer visits. He'd taken the small guest room upstairs, giving Max space to continue whatever routine he'd established in the 3 months since Raymond's heart attack. James ran his fingers along the wooden dresser, remembering how his grandfather would sit him on his knee and tell stories about the farm, about the generations of Reeds who had worked this land before them, about the seasons and the soil and the satisfaction of watching things grow. What would the old man think of him now? A failed graphic designer with an eviction notice in a pink slip, retreating to the very life his parents had rejected. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he unpacked his meager belongings. Through the window, he could see Max stalking toward the barn, keys jangling in his hand, shoulders hunched against the wind. There was something furtive in his movements, something that didn't sit right, the way a man moves when he doesn't want to be watched. James stood at the window long after Max disappeared into the barn. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in deeper shades of orange and purple. Somewhere a dog barked. The wind picked up, rattling the window frame. He thought about unpacking more, about settling in, but exhaustion from the drive suddenly hit him. Instead, he stretched out on the narrow bed, still wearing his jacket, and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. The silence was too complete. In Boston, there had always been noise. Cars passing, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the subway rumbling beneath the streets. Here there was nothing but wind and the occasional creak of old wood settling. His mind turned over questions he couldn't answer. Why had Raymond left him this place? What did his grandfather see in him that he couldn't see in himself? And why did Max look at him with such barely concealed resentment? Morning came too early, announced by light streaming through curtains he'd forgotten to close. James woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was. Then memory returned with the weight of the unfamiliar mattress beneath him and the smell of old wood and dust in his nostrils. Downstairs, he found Max already gone, though a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove. James poured himself a cup and stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the property in daylight. The fields stretched away in neat rectangles, though many showed signs of neglect. Weeds encroaching on the edges, fences that needed mending. The barn dominated the view, its red paint faded and peeling, but still standing solid despite its slight lean. He spent the morning exploring, reacquainting himself with childhood memories. The old oak tree where he'd attempted to build a tree house still stood tall, though the boards he'd nailed up had long since rotted away. The creek that ran along the eastern border babbled the same song he remembered, but everything felt different now. Older, more fragile, as if the whole property was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do with it. The barn drew his attention most. Max was right about one thing. It did need work. Several loose shingles on the roof. Some of the siding had warped with age and weather. But there was something about the structure that fascinated him, perhaps because Raymond had spent so much time there. James found himself walking around it in the evening light, studying its construction, imagining the decades of harvest it had sheltered. He didn't know that beneath his feet lay secrets that would change everything. Later that afternoon, James found himself in town, needing supplies and wanting to get a sense of the community his grandfather had been part of. The local diner sat on Main Street, its neon sign flickering even in daylight. He pushed through the door and was immediately enveloped by the smell of coffee and fresh pie and decades of accumulated cooking grease. A woman behind the counter looked up and her eyes widened. James Reed, as I live and breathe, your grandfather's boy. She came around the counter, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd worked the same space for years. Her silver-streaked hair was tied back in a bun, and her face had a few more lines than he remembered. But Mrs. Garcia's smile was exactly the same. She folded him in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and dish soap. I heard you inherited the farm. She slid a cup of coffee across the counter without being asked, fixing it exactly how he liked it, black with one sugar. How she remembered after all these years he couldn't say. About time someone brought some life back to that place. James wrapped his hands around the warm mug. Did he come here often? My grandfather? Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled. Every Saturday morning, regular as clockwork, sat right there at the corner booth, drinking coffee and talking with the other farmers. She leaned in, voice dropping conspiratorially. Your grandfather was so proud of you, always talking about his smart grandson in the big city. He had big plans for that farm, you know. What kind of plans? She glanced around, though the diner was nearly empty. He never said exactly, but he was always working on some project, buying supplies in town, hauling things out to that barn. Your Uncle Max was mighty interested in whatever it was. James felt a chill run up his spine. What kind of supplies? All sorts. Preservation materials from the hardware store. Display cases from the old museum when it closed down. Even had specialized lighting installed. Hank from the electric company did the work. She paused, wiping down the already clean counter. Said it was for his collection, but never would say what he was collecting. On the drive back to the farm, James stopped at the hardware store. The owner, Bill Henderson, remembered Raymond well. Best customer I ever had. Always needed something unusual. Archival boxes, special grade wood, dehumidifiers. He leaned against the counter, eyes distant with memory. Said he was preserving family heirlooms. Must have been quite a collection. Your uncle's been in a few times too, selling some of the equipment back. Said it was taking up too much space. The pieces were starting to fit together, though the picture they formed made little sense. What could his grandfather have been collecting that required such specialized equipment? And why would Max be selling it off? Back at the farm, James noticed Max's truck was gone. A note on the kitchen table said he'd be back late. Supply run to the county seat. This was his chance to get a closer look at the barn. The padlock on the main doors gleamed in the afternoon sun, heavy duty and impossible to pick with his limited skills. James circled the structure, looking for another way in. The windows were too high to reach without a ladder. The side door had the same type of lock. Frustrated, he was about to give up when he noticed something odd about one of the ground-level ventilation grates. It seemed looser than the others. Kneeling in the dirt, he pulled at the grate. It resisted at first, held by years of paint and rust. Then it came away in his hands, revealing a small opening, barely large enough to squeeze through. James looked around, feeling ridiculous and guilty at the same time. This was technically his property now, or would be in 6 months, but it still felt like trespassing. He pushed his backpack through first, then wriggled his way into the musty darkness of the barn. Inside, his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through dirty windows. Everything looked normal at first. Hay bales stacked against the walls, old farming equipment covered with tarps, tools hanging from wooden pegs worn smooth by decades of hands. But as he moved deeper into the space, he noticed irregularities. Drag marks in the dirt floor. Several areas where the ground seemed disturbed. Some of the hay bales had been moved recently. He could tell because the dust pattern underneath didn't match the outlines above. James started moving bales, checking behind them, looking for anything unusual. Most revealed nothing but more dirt floor and the occasional mouse nest. He was about to give up when he noticed that one of the tractors hadn't collected nearly as much dust as the others. Examining it closer, he realized it had been moved recently. Its wheels had left faint tracks in the dirt. The sound of tires on gravel made his heart leap into his throat. Max was back early. James quickly replaced the hay bales he'd moved and slipped back through the ventilation grate, carefully positioning it behind him. He'd barely made it to the porch when Max's truck rounded the corner of the house. That evening, a tense silence hung over the dinner table. Max seemed agitated, repeatedly checking his phone and stepping outside to make calls. When he returned from one such call, his eyes narrowed at James. "You've been in town, talking to people." James kept his expression neutral. "Just getting to know the area again. Met Mrs. Garcia at the diner. She remembers grandfather." Max's knuckles whitened around his fork. "People in this town talk too much. Don't believe everything you hear." Later that night, James was awakened by footsteps in his room. He lay still, eyes barely open, watching Max's silhouette move toward his desk. His uncle was rifling through papers there. The farming journals. James had found them in Raymond's study and had been reading through them, trying to understand what his grandfather had been doing in his final years. After a few minutes, Max seemed to find what he was looking for and quietly slipped out of the room. In the morning, James checked the journals. Several pages had been torn out, all entries from the summer 3 years ago. What had been on those pages that Max didn't want him to see? The answer came the next day when he returned from a walk to the creek. On the windshield of his car was a note, written in block letters, crude and threatening. "Leave the past buried or join it." The paper fluttered in his hand. A knot formed in his stomach. This was no longer just about inherited property or family tension. Something dangerous was happening here, and he was getting close to uncovering it. That afternoon, James drove back to town with a specific destination in mind. Mrs. Garcia had mentioned his grandfather was a regular at the diner, which meant she might know more than she'd initially shared. The lunch rush was over, and she was wiping down tables when he entered. Her smile faded as she saw his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." James placed the threatening note on the counter. "Someone left this on my car. I think Max doesn't want me looking into whatever grandfather was working on." Mrs. Garcia's eyes widened. She glanced toward the kitchen, then lowered her voice. "Your grandfather came to me about a month before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should give you something. Wait here." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "I promised I'd only give this to you, and only if you came asking questions." James's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was an old-fashioned key attached to a faded leather tag and a letter written in his grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. "James, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've started to notice things aren't right at the farm. The key opens the original lock to the barnside door, the one with the horseshoe above it. Max doesn't know about this key. What lies beneath supports what stands above. Our history is not ours alone to possess. Contact Dr. Sarah Running Bear at the number below. She knows everything about the project and can help you protect what I've spent 30 years building. Trust her as I did. Grandfather." Below was a phone number with an area code James didn't recognize. "Who's Dr. Running Bear?" he asked. Mrs. Garcia shook her head. Raymond mentioned her a few times. Some kind of professor or expert who visited the farm. They were working on a project together. Something about the land's history. That's all I know. Back in his car, James immediately tried the number. A recorded message informed him it had been disconnected. He pulled out his phone and searched for Dr. Sarah Running Bear. Several results appeared. An archaeology professor at the State University, author of papers on indigenous artifacts and ethical preservation methods. Most interestingly, he found a journal article co-authored by R. Reed and S. Running Bear. The title made his breath catch. Preservation Protocols for Agricultural Land with Historical Significance. His grandfather, the simple farmer, had been publishing academic papers. The Raymond Reed he remembered had been practical and hardworking and kind, but never scholarly. This added another layer to the mystery. James kept searching and found more articles, more collaborations between his grandfather and this Dr. Running Bear, all focused on indigenous cultural preservation, archaeological ethics, community-based stewardship. He returned to the farm with renewed determination. The key burned in his pocket as he waited for another opportunity to explore the barn. He got his chance the next morning when Max announced he needed to drive to the feed store in the next county. Once Max's truck disappeared down the driveway, James headed straight for the barnside door, the one with the rusted horseshoe nailed above it. Heart pounding, he inserted the key. It wouldn't turn. Examining the lock closer, he realized why. It had been replaced with a newer model. The key in his grandfather's letter was useless. Frustrated but undeterred, James circled the barn again. The ventilation grate he'd used before seemed like his best option. He had just removed it and was preparing to squeeze through when a sharp voice froze him in place. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Max stood 10 feet away, face flushed with anger. He must have doubled back after leaving. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. James straightened, still holding the grate. "It's my barn too. I have a right to see what's inside." Max advanced, eyes dark with rage. "There's nothing in there but dangerous equipment and rotting wood. The floor could give way any minute. I'm just trying to keep you from getting yourself killed." James stood his ground. "Then why the new locks? Why tear pages out of grandfather's journals? What are you hiding, Max?" For a moment, he thought Max might hit him. The older man's face contorted, a vein pulsing in his forehead. Then with visible effort, he reined himself in. "You want in the barn so bad? Fine, but on my terms." He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and strode to the main doors, unlocking them with sharp, angry movements. The doors swung open with a groan of protest. "See for yourself. Old tractors and hay. Nothing worth all this drama." James stepped inside cautiously, aware of Max watching his every move. The interior looked different from his brief glimpse days before. More organized, as if recently straightened. The hay bales he'd moved were back in perfect alignment. The space felt staged. He moved slowly around the perimeter, noting how Max tensed whenever he approached certain areas. There was definitely something hidden here, but he wouldn't find it with Max hovering over him. After making a show of examining the old equipment, James nodded. "Guess you're right. Just needed to see for myself." Max's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained suspicious. Now you've seen it. Stay out unless I'm with you. That roof beam could come down any day. He gestured to a wooden support that did indeed look worryingly rotted. James retreated, knowing he'd need to be more strategic. That night, he composed an email to Dr. Sarah Running Bear using the university address he'd found. He mentioned his grandfather and the key he'd found, asking if they could speak about the project. He wasn't sure if she'd respond or even if she still used this address, but it was worth trying. The next morning, an email notification woke him before dawn. Dr. Running Bear had replied. Her message was brief but urgent. Call me immediately. Do not discuss this with your uncle. The collection is at risk. She answered on the first ring, her voice low and intense. James Reed, Raymond's grandson. Yes, I found your contact information in a letter he left for me. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you since the funeral, but the lawyers wouldn't release your information. Her voice was tense with urgency. Your grandfather and I worked together for years documenting and preserving artifacts found on your farm. The site is incredibly significant, one of the most comprehensive collections of Oneida cultural items ever discovered on private land. James struggled to process this. My grandfather was collecting Native American artifacts, not just collecting, documenting an entire settlement that existed on that land for hundreds of years before European settlers arrived. The artifacts are historically priceless. But more importantly, they're culturally sacred to my people. She paused, her voice hardening. Your uncle has been selling pieces from the collection. I've tracked 3 items to private collectors already. Without proper provenance documentation, it's nearly impossible to recover them legally. James's mind raced, the coded list in Max's handwriting, the late-night barn visits, the mysterious canvas bags. It all made sense now. How many artifacts are we talking about? Over 400 documented pieces. Your grandfather built a climate-controlled underground chamber beneath the barn floor. That's where the collection is housed, or was. I need to see what remains. James explained about the new locks, the threatening note, Max's vigilance. She listened carefully, then said, I have copies of some of Raymond's documentation, including the legal agreement he made with the tribal council. That might help us gain legitimate access. In the meantime, don't confront your uncle. These artifacts are worth hundreds of thousands on the black market. People have been killed for less. After hanging up, James sat on the edge of his bed, mind reeling. His simple farmer grandfather had been operating a sophisticated archaeological preservation project right under the family's nose. And Max was systematically looting it. He needed proof before Dr. Running Bear arrived. Proof that wouldn't require breaking into the barn again. The farming journals. If his grandfather had been documenting his archaeological finds as carefully as Dr. Running Bear suggested, there must be records somewhere. James returned to the journals, reading with new understanding. What he'd taken for farming notes now revealed their true meaning. Northfield yielded 3 vessels after spring rain wasn't about crop containers. It was about pottery, archaeological artifacts. Eastern boundary markers established with proper documentation referred to survey points, not property lines. The gaps in the journal still puzzled him until he realized they might not be gaps at all, but separate records kept elsewhere. Somewhere Max wouldn't think to look. James methodically searched his grandfather's bedroom, checking under floorboards, behind drawers, inside hollow bedposts. Nothing. The office yielded similar results. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd about Raymond's favorite reading chair in the living room. The cushion seemed unusually firm on one side. Carefully slitting the seam with a pocket knife, James discovered a slim, leather-bound volume tucked inside the cushion stuffing. The first page bore a simple title, Collection Registry, Site R01. The contents confirmed everything Dr. Running Bear had told him. Detailed sketches of artifacts, precise measurements, photographs carefully pasted onto pages, GPS coordinates and dates. Most entries included notes about the historical and cultural significance of each item. The level of care and respect evident in his grandfather's documentation was remarkable. The final pages contained something even more damning, a complete inventory list with photographs of each artifact, numbered and categorized. James could use this to identify exactly what was missing. He was so engrossed in the registry that he didn't hear Max enter the house. The heavy hand on his shoulder made him jump, the book tumbling to the floor. What's that? Max's voice was dangerously quiet as he bent to pick up the registry. His face darkened as he flipped through the pages. Where did you find this? Grandfather's chair. Seems he kept better records than you gave him credit for. Max slammed the book shut. You have no idea what you're meddling with, city boy. This is family business. Selling off Native American artifacts is federal crime business. I know what you've been doing, Max. I've talked to Dr. Running Bear. Max's face paled, then flushed with anger. That woman has no right to interfere. Your grandfather lost his mind in his final years, getting mixed up with her and her tribal claims. This is Reed land. Everything found on it belongs to us. It belongs in a museum, which is exactly what grandfather was creating. James stood, putting distance between them. Dr. Running Bear is coming tomorrow with the documentation to prove it. Max stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You think anyone's going to believe some city kid who just showed up over me? I've been managing this farm for years. Everyone in town knows me. They'll think you're just trying to cash in on your inheritance. Maybe, but the registry in his hands spoke volumes. James knew it wasn't enough. He needed to see the collection for himself. Document what remained before confronting Max with authorities present. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake listening to Max moving around downstairs, the occasional murmur of phone conversations, the creak of the back door as his uncle made several trips to and from the barn. Around 2 a.m, the house finally fell silent. James crept to his window, watching as lights flickered in the barn before going dark. Max was preparing for something. The urgency in Dr. Running Bear's voice echoed in his mind. The collection is at risk. He couldn't wait until morning. Slipping downstairs required patience James hadn't known he possessed. Each step a deliberate placement of weight. Each creak of wood a potential alarm. The farmhouse breathed around him in the darkness, settling into itself the way old buildings do. He checked the back door first, finding it locked with the key removed. Max was being cautious, the front door the same. Then he remembered the cellar entrance, the old exterior doors his grandfather had used for bringing in preserved vegetables from the garden. The cellar doors angled up from the ground on the north side of the house, partly hidden by overgrown shrubs that scraped against his jacket as he pushed through. The padlock hanging there was old and rusted, likely untouched for years. James found a pry bar in the garden shed and with careful effort managed to break the lock without making too much noise. The hinges protested as he lifted one door, but the sound was lost in the wind moving through the trees. The cellar was cool and smelled of earth and old potatoes. His phone's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the dusty space as he navigated between forgotten jars of preserves and ancient garden tools. The interior stairs led up to the kitchen. The door at the top was unlocked. Max hadn't anticipated this route. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. James moved silently across the yard toward the barn, staying in the shadows cast by the moonlight. No sign of Max. His uncle must have returned to the house after his last trip. The barn stood silent, its weathered boards silvered in the pale light. The main doors were locked as expected, but James had learned something about the building's weaknesses during his previous explorations. Instead of trying to break in, he positioned himself behind a stack of firewood with a clear view of the barn entrance. If his suspicions were correct, Max would make his move before Dr. Running Bear arrived in the morning. The hours crawled by. James pulled his jacket tighter against the pre-dawn chill, fighting to stay awake. The eastern sky began to lighten, deep purple giving way to lighter shades. Birds started their morning songs, and just as the first golden rays touched the horizon, the farmhouse door opened. Max emerged carrying a duffel bag. He moved with purpose to his truck, stowed the ball in, then returned to the house. Moments later, he came out with a larger suitcase. James watched, heart pounding, as his uncle made 3 more trips, loading the truck with what appeared to be hastily packed belongings. Max was planning to run. On the final trip, Max headed not to the house but to the barn, unlocking the main doors and disappearing inside. This was the moment James had been waiting for. Moving quickly but quietly, he approached the barn, slipping through the partially open doors. Inside, the scene was illuminating. Several hay bales had been moved aside, revealing a section of the floor where the dirt had been disturbed. A wooden trap door stood open, warm light spilling up from below. James could hear Max moving around in the underground space, the sound of items being packed, glass or pottery clinking together. James positioned himself behind a tractor, phone camera ready to document whatever he was about to witness. Minutes later, Max climbed up a wooden ladder, a carefully wrapped bundle in his arms. He placed it in a waiting crate, then descended again. This continued several more times, Max retrieving items from below, wrapping them in cloth, placing them in crates. On his fifth trip up the ladder, Max froze, eyes locked on James's hiding spot. "Who's there?" His hand moved to his waistband, and with shock, James saw the glint of a pistol. An old revolver, probably Raymond's, but no less dangerous for its age. "It's me, Uncle." James stepped into view, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "You're taking the last of them, aren't you?" Clearing out before Dr. Running Bear arrives. Max's expression hardened, the gun still in his hand but pointed at the floor. "You don't understand what's at stake here. The farm is drowning in debt. Your precious grandfather refused every offer of modernization that might have made this place profitable. He was living in a fantasy world with his artifacts and museums while the bank sent foreclosure notices. So you decided to sell off his life's work, pieces of history that don't belong to you." Max laughed, bitter and hollow. "Don't belong to me? I've worked this land for 30 years while you were off getting fancy degrees. I was here watching the old man waste money on climate control for pottery fragments instead of fixing the tractor. Watching him pour resources into preserving the past while the present fell apart around us." James took a cautious step forward. "It's not too late to fix this, Uncle. Dr. Running Bear said there might be a way to recover the pieces you've already sold. The museum project could actually save the farm. That's what Grandfather was working toward." For a moment, doubt flickered across Max's face. Then his expression hardened again. "You think I didn't know about his plans?" He showed me the proposal. A museum run by the tribe with me, relegated to giving hayride tours to school children. This is Reed land, and I'll be damned if I hand it over to become some cultural heritage site. The gun in his hand rose slightly, not quite pointing at James, but the threat implicit. "You've got a choice to make. Walk away, no, forget what you saw, and I'll leave you the farm, free and clear. Otherwise," the threat hung in the air between them. James felt his throat go dry. He'd underestimated how desperate Max had become, how much anger and resentment had built up over the years. This wasn't just about money, it was about pride and respect and decades of feeling overlooked. "How much have you already sold?" Max seemed to relax slightly, perhaps taking James's question as interest rather than stalling. "Enough to clear the mortgage. 3 pieces to a collector in Chicago. He pays well, no questions asked." He gestured to the crates. "These are the real prize. Ceremonial items worth more than this whole farm 10 times over." "And what happens to Grandfather's legacy? 30 years of work, just gone?" "Legacy." Max spat the word. "What legacy? A collection nobody can see, buried under a barn." He waved the gun toward the trap door. "Go on, take a look. See what the old man valued more than making this farm work." James approached the opening cautiously, aware of Max behind him, the gun still in hand. A wooden ladder descended about 8 feet to what appeared to be a concrete floor. Warm light glowed from below. Taking a breath, keeping his movements slow and telegraphed, James began to descend. The space that opened before him took his breath away. A rectangular room about 12 by 20 feet with concrete walls and sophisticated lighting. Display cases lined the walls, many now empty, but some still containing artifacts. Pottery, arrowheads, jewelry, tools, all carefully labeled and preserved. Maps covered one wall, topographical surveys of the farm with various locations marked in red ink. A desk sat in one corner covered with ledgers and documents. It was a museum-quality installation hidden beneath the barn floor all these years. James moved slowly through the space, reading his grandfather's neat handwriting on the labels. Each one described not just what the object was, but where it had been found, when, and its significance. The care evident in every detail spoke of respect and dedication. This wasn't the work of a collector seeking profit. This was the work of a steward protecting something precious. Behind him, Max descended the ladder, gun still in hand, but his attention divided between James and the remaining artifacts. "When my father first found that pottery fragment while plowing the north field, I thought he'd lost his mind." Max's voice was softer now, almost reflective. "Spent a whole day on his hands and knees instead of finishing the planting. Then he found another. And another." He laughed without humor. "Became obsessed. Every season more digging, more cataloging. Money that should have gone into equipment went to these. These are historically priceless. James examined a delicately carved bone tool still in its case. This is a record of people who lived here for hundreds of years before our family ever arrived. Max snorted. Priceless to who? Museums that would have paid him nothing. That tribe that wanted to take control of our land. He shook his head. I found a buyer who understands their real value. The sound of tires on gravel drifted down from above. Max's head snapped up, eyes widening. You expecting someone? Before James could answer, a woman's voice called out, James, are you here? Dr. Running Bear. She'd arrived early. Max's expression darkened. He raised the gun, pointing it squarely at James now. Not a sound, you understand? We're going to go up there and you're going to tell her to leave. Say you made a mistake. If you say anything else, his meaning was clear. Heart pounding, James nodded. Max gestured for him to climb the ladder first, following close behind. At the top, James emerged into the barn to find Dr. Sarah Running Bear standing just inside the door. She was a woman in her 50s with graying black hair pulled back simply, wearing a denim jacket over practical clothes. Her dark eyes seemed to take in everything at once. The open trap door, James's tense posture, and then Max emerging behind him with the gun partially concealed but clearly present. I see I'm not interrupting anything important. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she encountered armed men in barns regularly. Just a nephew and uncle discussing family history, at gunpoint. This is private property. Max's face flushed with anger. You're trespassing. Dr. Running Bear reached into her bag and Max tensed, but she pulled out only a folder. Actually, I have documentation signed by Raymond granting me access to the collection at any time. She opened the folder, revealing papers covered with official stamps and signatures, including a court order preventing the removal of any artifacts from the premises pending a full inventory. Court orders don't mean much out here. Max's grip on the gun tightened. Perhaps not, she agreed, unfazed, but the federal agents waiting in my car might. She held up her phone. One call and they'll be here in seconds. They're quite interested in the 3 Oneida ceremonial vessels that recently appeared on the black market. James could see the calculations running behind his uncle's eyes, weighing his options, looking for a way out. The gun wavered slightly. Dr. Running Bear's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried steel beneath the calm surface. Max Reed, you're standing at a crossroads. One path leads to federal prison for trafficking in stolen cultural property. The other leads to a chance at making this right, but only if you make the choice now before more damage is done. Slowly, incrementally, Max lowered the gun. It was just business. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. The farm was drowning in debt. Dad refused to see reason. So you decided to steal and sell culturally significant artifacts instead of honoring your father's wishes? Dr. Running Bear shook her head, but her tone wasn't entirely condemning. The irony is Raymond had already secured funding for the museum project. The tribe was prepared to invest considerably in preserving both the collection and the agricultural heritage of this land. Max's face registered shock. What are you talking about? She turned to James, including him in the explanation. Your grandfather finalized an agreement with the tribal council 3 months before his death. The plan was to convert the barn into a proper museum, showcasing both the artifacts and the farming history of this land. The tribe would provide funding for renovation and ongoing maintenance in exchange for proper preservation and display of the collection. Her voice softened slightly. He was so excited to tell you both. The letter went out the week before his heart attack. James remembered the torn pages from the journal, the missing correspondence. Had Max destroyed his grandfather's attempts to share this plan? Why didn't he tell me himself? Max's question came out barely above a whisper. Dr. Running Bear regarded him steadily. According to his journal, he approached you several times, but you dismissed his museum talk without letting him explain. Eventually, he decided to wait until the legal paperwork was finalized before trying again. The gun in Max's hand seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds suddenly. He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, then carefully placed it on a nearby hay bale. There's still a way forward. James spoke up, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. We can contact the buyers, try to recover what's been sold. The museum can still happen. Max's laugh was hollow. You think anyone's going to let me be part of this now? After what I've done? That depends. Dr. Running Bear's tone was firm, but not unkind. On whether you're willing to make amends, the first step would be returning everything you haven't yet sold and providing information about the buyers who have the rest. For a long moment, the barn was silent, save for the wind rattling loose shingles overhead. Then with a defeated sigh, Max nodded. I've got names and contact information in the house, and receipts for what I've sold. Most of the collection is still here. I was planning to move the valuable pieces today. Dr. Running Bear's face showed controlled anger, but also something that might have been understanding. I'll need to call in my team to document what remains and begin recovery efforts for the missing pieces. She turned to James. Your grandfather believed in you, said you had the perfect combination of respect for tradition and forward-thinking creativity. That's why he left the farm to you. He wanted someone who would honor the past while building toward the future. James looked around the barn, seeing it not as it was, but as it could be, a place where history was preserved and shared, where the story of this land and all who had lived on it would be told for generations to come. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the farmyard. A new day was beginning at the Reed farm, and with it the chance to uncover truths long buried beneath its soil. Dr. Running Bear made several calls, her voice professional but urgent. Within an hour, a team began arriving. 2 specialists from the Tribal Cultural Office and a state archaeologist. They moved with practiced efficiency, setting up equipment in the underground chamber, beginning the careful process of documenting what remained. Max provided the buyer information without resistance, though shame was written in every line of his weathered face. He sat at the kitchen table going through receipts and phone records, building a complete picture of what he'd sold and to whom. James watched his uncle work, seeing not a criminal, but a desperate man who'd made terrible choices. The discovery of the collection's true nature and purpose seemed to have broken something in Max, or perhaps revealed something that had been broken for a long time. The pride that wouldn't let him accept help, the resentment at being overlooked, the fear that he wasn't enough. Dr. Running Bear's team worked methodically through the morning. James descended into the chamber several times, watching them photograph and catalog each remaining artifact. The specialists handled everything with reverence, as if touching sacred objects, which in a sense they were. One of them, a young man named Marcus, explained to James the significance of various pieces. This pottery style indicates trade networks extending hundreds of miles. These tools show sophisticated metalworking techniques. This jewelry isn't just decorative, it marks social status and family connections. Each artifact told a story, and together they formed a narrative of a people who had lived here, thrived here for generations before being displaced. Raymond Reed had recognized the importance of preserving these stories. He'd spent 3 decades of his life ensuring they wouldn't be lost. By midday, Agent Calloway from the FBI arrived. Tall and precise in his movements, he interviewed Max in the kitchen while James and Dr. Running Bear reviewed the documentation in the underground chamber. The inventory Raymond had kept was meticulous, every find recorded with location, date, condition, and context. Photographs taken from multiple angles, notes about soil composition and surrounding features. This is exceptional work. Dr. Running Bear turned pages carefully, her professional admiration evident. Most amateur archaeologists destroy context in their eagerness to collect. Raymond preserved everything. This documentation is as valuable as the artifacts themselves. She looked up at James. He taught himself proper archaeological methods, consulted experts, built this climate-controlled space at considerable personal expense. The tribal council recognized early on that he wasn't a looter or collector. He was a steward. Why didn't he tell us? James asked. Why keep it secret? Dr. Running Bear considered the question. I think he was waiting for the right time, when the legal framework was in place, when he had something complete to show rather than just a work in progress. She glanced toward the latter, and maybe he sensed Max wouldn't understand until he could see the full vision. The afternoon brought the discovery of something James had noticed in Raymond's cryptic letter, a reference to a secondary storage location. While the team continued their inventory, James searched the property, looking for any structure or space that might house additional artifacts. He found it almost by accident, the old root cellar at the far edge of the north field, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. The padlock was newer than the weathered doors, and when he tried the key from his grandfather's letter, it turned smoothly. Inside was another carefully organized space, smaller than the main chamber, but equipped with similar climate control. Metal cabinets lined the walls, each labeled with catalog numbers. A small desk held a laptop, external hard drive, and camera equipment. Dr. Running Bear arrived as James was examining the first cabinet. Recent finds, she noted, looking at the tagged items, documented within the last 2 years. And these, opening another cabinet, appear to be the items mentioned in the transfer notes, moved here due to water concerns in the main chamber. But it was the third cabinet that made her breath catch. Inside, mounted on special stands, were exact plaster replicas of the stolen ceremonial vessels, along with comprehensive documentation folders for each one. Your grandfather created authentication packages. She examined the materials with growing appreciation. Complete provenance documentation. She picked up an external hard drive labeled video documentation. This could be exactly what we need to recover the stolen pieces. James connected the drive to the laptop. Dozens of video files appeared, organized by artifact number. He clicked on one labeled CV03, the code for one of the stolen vessels. The screen filled with footage of Raymond carefully excavating a partially buried clay pot. His voice provided running commentary on location, soil conditions, surrounding context. The video continued through the cleaning process, detailed examination, careful measurement, every distinctive marking captured, every unique feature documented. The crack pattern that had been repaired using traditional methods clearly visible. Dr. Running Bear was already on her phone with Agent Calloway. This is exactly what we need: clear chain of custody, documented excavation, distinctive identifying features. She listened for a moment. Yes, I'll bring the drive to you now. Over the next 2 days, the investigation intensified. Armed with Raymond's video evidence, Agent Calloway contacted Edward Whitaker, the Chicago collector who'd purchased the most valuable pieces. Faced with irrefutable documentation, Whitaker agreed to return the vessels rather than face prosecution. The other buyers Max had dealt with proved more cooperative once they understood they'd been sold stolen property. 9 of the 12 pieces were already recovered or in process of being returned. Max himself remained subdued, helping where he could, providing additional details about his transactions when asked. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. James found him one evening sitting on the porch steps, staring out at fields he'd worked for 30 years. "I messed up, kid." Max's voice was rough with emotion. "Dad tried to tell me about the museum plan. Came to me with all these papers and projections. I thought it was just another one of his crazy ideas. Didn't even let him finish explaining." James settled beside him on the steps. "Why did you start selling the artifacts?" "After the funeral, I found all the documentation about the collection. Got curious about what it might be worth. Called a dealer in Chicago who'd left his card with Dad years ago." Max shook his head. One thing led to another. The farm was underwater on the mortgage. I convinced myself I was just doing what was necessary to save the family legacy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. In trying to save one legacy, Max had nearly destroyed another. "An FBI agent is coming tomorrow," James said quietly. "Dr. Running Bear says if you cooperate fully, provide all the buyer information, help recover the sold pieces, they might consider reduced charges." Max nodded, resignation in every line of his body. "I'll tell them everything I know." His eyes lifted to meet James's. "What will you do with the place?" James looked out over the fields, the weathered barn, the farmhouse that had sheltered generations of reeds. For the first time since arriving, he could see possibilities instead of burdens. "I think I'll honor Grandfather's plan. Build the museum. Maybe find a way to keep the farm operational too." The meeting with the tribal council representatives came a week later. 3 members accompanied by their legal counsel and cultural affairs director. They toured the collection, examined the documentation, discussed the proposed museum plans with professional interest, but reserved judgment. Walter Schuyler, the most senior council member, addressed James directly after the tour. A dignified man in his 70s with silver hair and penetrating dark eyes. "Your grandfather did something remarkable here, not just preserving these items, but documenting them properly, keeping them in context. Many collectors take artifacts as curiosities, stripping them of meaning. Raymond Reed understood these objects tell stories that belong to all of us." The formal meeting addressed legal complexities. The collection would remain physically at the Reed farm, but with official recognition of the tribe's cultural ownership of indigenous artifacts. The museum would be jointly operated with tribal representatives having final authority on how sacred items were displayed and interpreted. The funding would be expanded to include James's proposed agricultural education program. Construction could begin as soon as permits were approved, with a target opening date the following summer. As the meeting concluded, Walter Schuyler fixed Max with a steady gaze. "We understand you have been cooperating with authorities to recover the stolen items. The council acknowledges this positive step." His expression remained solemn. "Actions have consequences that can't be undone, but moving forward in a good way matters." Max nodded, accepting both the acknowledgement and the implicit reminder of his responsibility. After the delegation departed, James spent the evening walking the property, trying to see it through new eyes. Not just as the farm he'd visited as a child, but as a place of layered histories. The fields where his grandfather had planted corn were the same fields where Oneida farmers had grown crops centuries earlier. The creek that marked the eastern property line had provided water to countless generations. Standing beside that creek in the gathering dusk, James felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in Boston. His grandfather had recognized something profound about this land and had dedicated his final years to honoring it. Now that responsibility had passed to him. The work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, James Reed knew exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks following Dr. Running Bear's arrival moved with a deceptive calm that James had learned not to trust. Recovery efforts were underway. Legal paperwork accumulated in neat stacks on the kitchen table. The underground chamber hummed with the sound of climate control and careful documentation. But beneath the surface of methodical work, pressure was building. Agent Calloway's investigation had expanded beyond Max's sales to encompass the entire dealer network that had facilitated the theft. Names emerged from the shadows. Jim Henderson, Raymond's supposed friend and collaborator, had been selling artifacts for at least 3 years before his death. Edward Whitaker in Chicago was just one buyer among many. The scope of the theft was larger than anyone had initially realized. James spent his mornings in the underground chamber with Dr. Running Bear's team, learning to handle artifacts properly, understanding how each piece fit into the larger story. The work was meticulous and humbling. Every pottery fragment required careful examination. Every tool edge held information about use and wear. The indigenous peoples who had lived here for centuries had left traces of their lives in these objects, and reading those traces required patience and respect. Marcus, one of the tribal specialists, had become something like a friend, a man in his 40s with steady hands and careful eyes. He taught James how to hold delicate pieces, how to photograph them properly, how to read the subtle variations in clay composition that revealed trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. This vessel was made with clay from the river valley 30 miles north. Marcus pointed to distinctive mineral inclusions visible under magnification. But the decorative style matches pottery found 200 miles west, which means either the potter traveled or the techniques spread through teaching and trade. "How can you tell all that from a broken pot?" James asked. "Because my grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her." Marcus's voice carried quiet pride. "This isn't just archaeology, it's family history." The comment stayed with James. He'd been thinking of the collection as historical artifacts, important but distant. Marcus's words reminded him these were living connections. Someone's grandmother had shaped this clay. Someone's grandfather had carved these tools. The past wasn't dead. It lived in the memories and blood of people standing right here. 2 weeks into the recovery process, Agent Calloway arrived with news that drained the color from Dr. Running Bear's face. Edward Whitaker was claiming the 3 ceremonial vessels had been legally acquired through proper channels. He had documentation, which the FBI's forensics team determined were sophisticated forgeries, suggesting the items had been in private hands for decades. But that wasn't the worst of it. Whitaker had hired a legal team that specialized in cultural property law. They were arguing that even if the provenance documents were questionable, their client had purchased in good faith from a licensed dealer. They were prepared to fight recovery in court, which could take years. James felt rage building in his chest. "So he just keeps them? After we proved they were stolen?" Calloway's expression was grim. "Unless we have irrefutable evidence connecting these specific vessels to your grandfather's excavations, Whitaker's lawyers will tie this up in litigation for years. And given his resources, they might win." Dr. Running Bear sat very still, hands folded on the table. Her voice when she spoke was controlled, but James could hear the fury beneath. "Those vessels aren't just valuable artifacts. They're sacred objects used in coming-of-age ceremonies for my people. They should never have been removed from tribal custody. Ever." She looked at James. Your grandfather documented everything. There has to be more than just the inventory photographs. Field notes, excavation records, something that proves beyond doubt where these came from. James thought about a hidden registry, the root cellar, his grandfather's obsessive documentation. There had to be something they'd missed, some piece of evidence Raymond had preserved against exactly this scenario. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the old house settle, thinking about his grandfather's words. What lies beneath supports what stands above. Every time Raymond had mentioned the collection, he'd emphasized documentation. Not just what was found, but how and where and when. Context mattered as much as the objects themselves. At 2 in the morning, James gave up on sleep and went to the study. He began going through Raymond's papers again, this time looking for any reference to video or photographic documentation of excavations. The journals mentioned photography but not specifics. The inventory listed artifacts but didn't describe documentation methods. Then he found it, a notation in the margin of an early journal entry. RC backup for critical finds. Video protocol established. RC, the initials that had led him to the root cellar before. But this mentioned video specifically. James grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the night. The root cellar stood silent and cold. Inside, the laptop and equipment sat exactly as they'd left them. James began searching systematically through every storage device, every thumb drive, every external hard drive. He found the video files just before dawn, dozens of recordings organized by artifact code, and there labeled CV01, CVR2, CVR3 were the 3 stolen ceremonial vessels. James played the first file. His grandfather's voice filled the small space, describing the excavation process in careful detail. The camera showed Raymond working in a measured grid, documenting soil layers, recording GPS coordinates, photographing the vessel in situ before removal. Every step captured, every detail preserved. The vessel showed distinctive characteristics, crack patterns, mineral deposits, unique decorative elements. Characteristics that would be impossible to replicate or claim came from another source. This was the evidence they needed. James called Dr. Running Bear despite the early hour. She answered immediately, as if she too had been awake. Her response was one word: come. By 8 that morning, they were in Agent Calloway's office, playing the videos. The federal agent watched in silence, taking notes. When the third video finished, he sat back with something approaching a smile. This changes everything. He reached for his phone. Whitaker's legal team won't be able to argue good faith purchase when we have video documentation of the actual excavation. I'll have the U.S. Attorney's Office contact them today. But Dr. Running Bear's expression remained troubled. This solves the immediate problem. But there's something larger we need to address. She pulled out a file. My research indicates Jim Henderson wasn't working alone. The dealer network he connected with has been operating for over a decade. They've sold hundreds of items. Whitaker is just one buyer. She spread documents across the desk. Look at the patterns. Henderson started small, testing the market, but as demand grew, he expanded operations. He wasn't just taking artifacts from Reed property. He was working with landowners across 3 counties, convincing farmers that artifacts they found were worth cash, creating a pipeline from rural excavation sites to wealthy collectors in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. James felt sick. How many artifacts are we talking about? Dr. Running Bear's voice was quiet, potentially thousands, and most will never be recovered because they were taken before anyone documented what existed. The investigation shifted focus. Agent Calloway brought in additional resources, a task force dedicated to cultural property theft. They began tracking the dealer network, identifying buyers, building cases. It was painstaking work that would take months or years to complete. Meanwhile, faced with video evidence they couldn't refute, Whitaker's attorneys negotiated a return of the 3 vessels. But the recovery came with conditions. Whitaker wanted immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing information about the dealer network and other collectors he knew. The decision wasn't James's to make alone. This affected the tribal nation's cultural heritage as much as the Reed collection. A meeting was called with the tribal council to discuss how to proceed. The council chamber was simple but dignified, a circular room with windows facing east to greet the sunrise. James sat with Dr. Running Bear and Agent Calloway on one side. Across from them, Walter Schuyler and 4 other council members. Walter spoke first. We must decide between justice and recovery. If we insist on prosecuting this man, he will fight to keep the vessels. His lawyers will delay for years. Our sacred objects remain in his possession while legal battles drag on. One of the younger council members, a woman named Sarah, spoke up. But if we grant immunity, we tell others there are no real consequences for stealing our heritage. That money and lawyers can buy absolution. The debate continued for over an hour. James mostly listened, understanding this wasn't his call to make. These were tribal objects. The decision belonged to the people whose ancestors had created them. Finally, Walter raised his hand for silence. We have fought for generations to preserve our culture against those who would erase it. We have survived removal, boarding schools, policies designed to destroy our identity. He looked around the circle. These vessels are important, but they are not more important than our values. And our values say that recovery and teaching matter more than revenge. He turned to Agent Calloway. We will accept the terms. The man returns what he stole. He provides information to help recover other items. And in exchange, he faces no prosecution from us. But, his voice hardened, make certain he understands. This mercy is given once. If he or anyone he knows deals in stolen cultural property again, there will be no negotiation. The vessels were returned 3 weeks later. Doreen Running Bear received them personally, transporting them in climate-controlled containers from Chicago back to the farm. James helped carry them into the underground chamber, feeling the weight of what they represented. Not just ancient pottery, but cultural continuity. Sacred objects returned to the people who made them. That evening, the tribal council held a private ceremony. James and Max were invited to attend, but asked to observe silently. They stood at the edge of the gathering while elders performed rituals that had been practiced for centuries. Songs in the Oneida language, prayers for the ancestors who crafted these vessels, gratitude for their return. James couldn't understand the words, but he felt their power. This was why the work mattered. Not abstract preservation, but keeping spiritual and cultural practices alive. After the ceremony, Walter approached them. You have returned something sacred that was taken. This creates obligation, not burden, but relationship. You are now connected to these objects and to the people they belong to. That connection requires ongoing responsibility. Max spoke up, voice rough with emotion. I nearly destroyed that connection. I sold pieces of your heritage for money. Why would you trust us now? Walter regarded him steadily. Because you returned what you took. Because you speak truth about your failures. Because you show up and do the work even when it's difficult. He paused. Trust isn't given for what someone says. It's earned by what they do over time. You're earning it. The recovery of Whittaker's vessels opened doors. Other collectors, hearing about the video evidence and the serious federal investigation, began reaching out through intermediaries. Some wanted to avoid prosecution. Others seemed genuinely disturbed to learn they possessed stolen property. Over the following weeks, 12 more items were returned. Each recovery required negotiation, documentation, verification. The work consumed James's days and invaded his dreams. But slowly, piece by piece, the collection was being restored. Not everything could be recovered. 3 items had been sold to international buyers beyond U.S. jurisdiction. They were gone permanently. Dr. Running Bear insisted on acknowledging these losses in the museum plans. Empty display cases with explanations about theft and the ongoing challenges of protection. These gaps teach as much as the objects themselves, she explained. They remind visitors that preservation requires vigilance, that what's lost often can't be recovered. The investigation also revealed Jim Henderson's deeper betrayal. He'd begun selling artifacts at least 3 years before his death, possibly longer. He'd used his relationship with Raymond to gain access, to learn what was most valuable, to identify pieces that wouldn't be immediately missed. The discovery of Henderson's storm cellar yielded another 40 artifacts, many from the boundary area between Reed and Henderson properties. This created new complications. Who owned items found on disputed property lines? How could anyone prove which side an artifact originally came from? The legal questions were complex enough to require consultation with cultural heritage attorneys and tribal legal experts. After weeks of negotiation, a compromise emerged. Items definitively sourced to Reed property would join the museum collection. Artifacts clearly from Henderson land would be split between the museum and the County Historical Society. Sacred items would be repatriated regardless of origin. Through all of this, Max remained present, doing whatever was asked of him, testifying in depositions, providing detailed information about his transactions, helping to authenticate recovered items by describing exactly how he'd packaged and transported them. His cooperation was complete and his remorse evident, but the shame didn't leave his eyes. James would find him sometimes just standing in the underground chamber, looking at the artifacts he'd nearly sold off piece by piece. Once he asked if Max was all right. "I'm trying to understand how I could have been so blind." Max's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad showed me this place, explained what he was doing, and I dismissed it as old man foolishness." He shook his head. "I was so busy feeling overlooked that I couldn't see what mattered." "You see it now," James offered. "That's what counts." Max turned to face him. "Does it, though? Seeing your mistake after you've already made it? I nearly destroyed something irreplaceable out of spite and greed. There's no making that right." James thought about his own failures, the jobs he'd lost, the relationships he'd damaged, the years spent drifting without purpose. Maybe making it right isn't the goal. Maybe it's about what you build after, whether you let failure define you or use it to become someone better. The words seemed to settle something for Max. He nodded slowly and returned to work. 6 weeks after Dr. Running Bear's arrival, the tribal council scheduled a formal site visit to review the collection and propose museum plans. 5 elders would come, accompanied by cultural specialists and family members. Their approval was essential. Without tribal endorsement, the museum project would lack legitimacy and moral authority. James spent days preparing, working with Dr. Running Bear to ensure every aspect of the exhibition plan respected tribal protocols. Some artifacts required special handling. Others needed specific positioning or context. The language and interpretive materials had to be reviewed word by word. The morning the delegation arrived, James felt a nervousness he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't bureaucratic approval. This was about whether his grandfather's life work would be validated or rejected, whether the Reed family could be trusted as genuine partners in cultural preservation. Walter Schuyler led the group, 5 elders, 3 women and 2 men, ranging in age from 60s to 80s. They moved through the spaces with unhurried dignity, examining artifacts, reading labels, asking questions that revealed deep knowledge. In the underground chamber, one elder, a woman with silver hair and strong hands, paused before a pottery display. She spoke in Oneida, her voice carrying authority. Dr. Running Bear translated. "She says these pieces come from the eastern boundary area. The clay is from the riverbed near Henderson Creek. Her grandmother worked with clay from that same source. She recognizes the mineral content and firing patterns." The woman continued speaking, now in English. "My grandmother made vessels like these. I watched her as a girl, learned the songs that accompanied the work." She touched the glass case gently. "I thought that knowledge was lost. My children never learned. But seeing these, knowing they were preserved, maybe it's not too late to remember." James felt his throat tighten. This was why it mattered. Not just saving old objects, but keeping connections alive between generations. The formal feedback session came that afternoon in the farmhouse living room. The elders sat in a semicircle. James, Max, and Dr. Running Bear faced them. The atmosphere was serious but not hostile. Walter spoke for the group. "Your grandfather understood something important, that these objects are not isolated curiosities. They're part of living traditions, connections between past and present. He documented with respect and care." But, his expression grew stern, a museum cannot be static. It cannot be only about what was. It must also serve what is. The living community, our young people who need to understand their heritage, our elders who carry knowledge that should be shared. One of the younger specialists, a man named Thomas, elaborated. "We propose regular cultural programming, craft demonstrations where our artisans can teach traditional techniques, storytelling sessions where elders share oral histories, seasonal celebrations that connect these historical artifacts to contemporary practice." Another elder raised concerns about sacred items. Some objects were not meant for general viewing. Some required restrictions on who could see them and under what circumstances. The museum design needed to accommodate separate spaces with controlled access. These weren't simple requests. They required fundamental rethinking of typical museum operations. But James found himself agreeing to each proposal. This wasn't his collection to display however he wanted. It was a shared responsibility, and that meant accepting limitations on his own authority. The meeting stretched into evening. Complex questions about governance, decision-making authority, financial arrangements. Who would have final say on exhibition content? How would ongoing operating costs be covered? What happened if the partnership broke down? The solutions emerged slowly through careful negotiation. A joint board with representatives from both the Reed family and tribal nation. Shared authority on exhibition decisions with tribal members having final say on sacred items. Operating costs covered through admission fees, grants, and tribal nation contributions. As the sun set, the elders caucused privately in Oneida. James waited with Max and Dr. Running Bear, trying to read their body language through the window. Finally, Walter emerged. The council will recommend to our nation that this partnership move forward, contingent on the changes we've discussed being incorporated into the final plans. He paused. But understand, this is not one-time approval. We will remain involved. We will monitor how the museum operates. We will expect ongoing consultation and respect. He turned to Max. And we acknowledge your cooperation in recovering what was taken. The council has decided to write a letter to the court supporting your request for reduced charges. Your actions after your crime matter as much as the crime itself. Max's eyes reddened, but his voice stayed steady. Thank you, I won't waste the chance you're giving me. After the delegation left, James stood on the porch watching their vehicles disappear down the drive. Dr. Running Bear joined him. That went better than I expected, she said. The elders saw genuine commitment, saw that you're willing to share authority, not just seek their stamp of approval. James nodded, feeling the weight of new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. This was larger than he'd imagined. Not just operating a museum, but maintaining relationships, honoring commitments, navigating between different communities and perspectives. You look worried, Dr. Running Bear observed. I'm worried I'll mess this up, that I'll fail to honor what my grandfather built. She smiled. Welcome to stewardship. That worry is healthy. It means you understand what's at stake. She gestured toward the barn. The difference between you and Max is that he let his fear drive him to protect himself at the expense of what mattered. You're letting your fear drive you to work harder at getting it right. That evening, Max found James in the study, reviewing the notes from the tribal council meeting. His uncle looked tired, the lines in his face deeper than they'd been months ago. Walter took me aside before he left. Max said, told me about a teaching program they run for troubled youth. Kids who've made mistakes, gotten in trouble. They work with elders to learn traditional skills and values. He paused. Asked if I'd be willing to help teach the farming component. Show kids how to work the land the old way. James looked up. What did you say? Max's voice was rough. I said I wasn't sure I had any business teaching anyone anything, given what I'd done. And what did Walter say? Max smiled despite himself. Said that making mistakes qualified me to teach better than never having failed would. That kids who've messed up need to see adults who've messed up and found their way back. Will you do it? Max looked out the window at the darkening fields. Yeah, I think I will. As winter approached and construction planning intensified, James found himself thinking often about his grandfather. About what Raymond would make of all this. The partnerships with the tribal nation. The complex governance structures, the evolution of his private passion into a community institution. He pulled out the letter Raymond had left him, reading it again with new understanding. Trust her as I did. His grandfather had known Dr. Running Bear would be essential, had known the tribal partnership was critical, had known this couldn't be the Reed family project alone. What lies beneath supports what stands above. The artifacts beneath the barn floor supporting the museum above. The indigenous history beneath the surface supporting the contemporary community above. The foundation Raymond had built supporting everything that came after. James folded the letter carefully. His grandfather had started something that outlived him. Now it was James's turn to carry it forward. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but with the same dedication to doing it right. Outside, snow began to fall. The first of the season. The farm settling into winter stillness. But inside the farmhouse and in the underground chamber below the barn, the work continued. Planning, documenting, negotiating, building. The slow, patient work of creating something meant to last. Max came in from checking the barn, stamping snow from his boots. He paused in the doorway. You doing okay, kid? James looked up from his papers. Yeah, just thinking about grandfather, about everything he set in motion. Max crossed to the window, looking out at the barn barely visible through the snow. You know what I remember most about him? It's not the farming or even this collection. It's that he never quit on anything. Once he decided something mattered, he saw it through, no matter how long it took. He turned back to James. That's what you're doing now. Seeing it through. I think that would matter to him more than anything. They stood together in the warm kitchen as snow continued to fall. Two men bound by blood and failure and slowly rebuilding trust. Both carrying forward a legacy neither had chosen but both now embraced. The work ahead was enormous. The museum to build, the relationships to maintain, the stories to tell and retell for generations not yet born. But tonight they could rest, knowing the foundation was solid, the partnerships genuine, the purpose clear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions without easy answers, new moments requiring wisdom and patience. But that was the nature of stewardship. Not a destination reached, but a path walked daily with care and commitment. James turned off the study light and headed upstairs. Behind him, Max checked the doors and windows, securing the house against the winter night. Outside, the snow covered the fields in white, erasing boundaries, making the land look like a blank page waiting for new stories to be written. But beneath that snow, beneath the frozen ground, the artifacts remained. Silent witnesses to all that had been and all that might yet be, connecting past to present to future in an unbroken chain of responsibility and care. And in the morning, the work would continue. Winter came to the Reed farm with the kind of cold that tested everything. Buildings, equipment, resolve. The kind of cold that showed you what was solid and what would crack under pressure. James woke most mornings to frost covering the inside of his bedroom window. Intricate patterns like ancient maps drawn by the night. The museum project couldn't stop for weather. If anything, the urgency increased. Agent Calloway's task force had identified over 30 collectors who'd purchased artifacts through the dealer network Henderson had used. Each one needed to be contacted, investigated, negotiated with. Some would cooperate, others would fight. All of it would take time they didn't necessarily have. Dr. Running Bear arrived one December morning with a list that made James's stomach sink. Edward Whitaker wants to meet, not through lawyers, directly. He says he's reconsidering his position on other items in his collection. James studied her he had a face. Is this genuine or another legal maneuver? Her expression was carefully neutral. His attorney called mine. Whitaker has apparently realized that if 3 vessels were stolen, other pieces in his collection probably are too. He's looking at potential prosecution on multiple counts. She paused. He's scared, and scared men make deals. Agent Calloway confirmed it. Whitaker's entire collection is under scrutiny now. He acquired most of it through the same dealer network. The smart play for him is to voluntarily return questionable items and provide information about his sources. Reduces his legal exposure considerably. The trip to Chicago was scheduled for the following week. James would go with Dr. Running Bear and Agent Calloway to examine items Whitaker claimed might have come from Reed or Henderson property. 12 pieces total. If even half were genuine Reed artifacts, it would significantly expand the recovered collection. The morning of the trip, Max drove James to the bus station. They rode in silence through snow-covered fields, the heater in the old truck fighting a losing battle against the cold. Your grandfather took me to Chicago once. Max spoke suddenly. I was maybe 16. We went to the Field Museum. He wanted me to see how artifacts should be properly cared for and displayed. James waited, sensing there was more. I thought it was the most boring day of my life. Max's laugh held no humor. Just old stuff behind glass. Couldn't understand why he cared so much. He kept trying to explain about preservation and context and responsibility. I just wanted to leave. What changed? Max pulled into the station parking lot and killed the engine. Nothing changed while he was alive. I was too stubborn to listen, too busy feeling like his interests were an insult to the real work of farming. He gripped the steering wheel. It wasn't until after, when I was going through his papers, that I started to understand. And by then it was too late to tell him I finally got it. He turned to James. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until you can't say the things that matter. The bus rolled through frozen landscape, small towns that looked like they'd been there forever. Farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys. The land his grandfather had chosen to dedicate his life to understanding and preserving. Chicago felt like a salt after months of rural quiet. The noise and motion and sheer density of people. Dr. Running Bear met him at the station, Agent Calloway already waiting. They drove through streets where wealth announced itself in architecture and landscaping. Whitaker's gallery occupied a restored brownstone in an exclusive neighborhood, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. Inside, walls displayed what he called primitive art, though the term made Dr. Running Bear's jaw tighten. Edward Whitaker was a man in his 60s, expensively dressed and professionally friendly in a way that felt calculated. But James noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to Agent Calloway. This was a man trying to control a situation that had escaped his control. "I want to be clear about something," Whitaker began, skipping pleasantries. "I purchased every item in my collection in good faith, through dealers I believe to be legitimate. If some items were improperly sourced, I'm as much a victim as anyone." Dr. Running Bear's voice could have cut glass. "The victims are the people whose heritage was stolen and sold. You were a willing buyer in a black market that's operated for decades. There's a difference." Whitaker's professional mask slipped for a moment, showing anger beneath. Then Agent Calloway intervened smoothly, redirecting to business. The items in question. The examination took hours, each piece brought out one at a time, each compared against Raymond's documentation. The video evidence proved crucial again. 5 items matched perfectly with footage of Raymond excavating them. Another 4 showed distinctive characteristics that aligned with photographs and notes. The remaining 3 were more ambiguous, likely from the same general area and time period, but without definitive proof. Dr. Running Bear argued for their inclusion anyway, given the preponderance of evidence. In Whitaker's admission, they came through compromised sources. The legal paperwork was complex. Whitaker's attorneys had prepared transfer documents that protected him from prosecution while returning the items. Agent Calloway reviewed every clause. Dr. Running Bear ensured proper provenance information was included. James mostly watched, learning how these negotiations worked at this level. During a break, Whitaker approached James directly. His professional demeanor had dropped away, replaced by something that might have been genuine reflection. "Your grandfather spent 30 years building that collection." Whitaker's voice was quiet. "I spent 30 minutes buying pieces of it." He paused. "It took federal agents showing up to make me understand what these objects actually represented, what they meant beyond their market value." James met his eyes. "That's the difference between collecting and stewarding. My grandfather understood these weren't possessions to own, they were responsibilities to fulfill." Whitaker looked away. "I've spent 40 years collecting what I called primitive art, built one of the finest private collections in the country." He gestured at the gallery walls. "And I'm just now understanding I never actually saw what I was looking at. I saw value and rarity and aesthetic appeal. Never saw the people who made these things or what they meant to those people." James said nothing. Some realizations came too late to matter. They signed the final papers in silence. 12 more pieces recovered. 12 more fragments of the story that could be properly told. But Dr. Running Bear's expression on the drive back to the city center was troubled. In the car, she pulled out a file that had been growing thicker by the week. "This is bigger than we thought." She spread documents across her lap. "The dealer network Henderson connected with has been operating for over 15 years. They've sold hundreds, possibly thousands of items. Whitaker is just one buyer among dozens." She showed them the patterns. Dealers working with landowners across 3 counties, convincing farmers that artifacts they found plowing fields were worth cash, creating a pipeline from rural excavation sites to wealthy collectors in major cities. No documentation, no archaeological context preserved, just objects extracted and sold. How do we stop something that large? James felt overwhelmed by the scope. "We can't. Not completely." Dr. Running Bear's voice carried frustration born of experience. "We can shut down this particular network, prosecute the dealers still operating, put pressure on auction houses and galleries to verify provenance. But there will always be another network, another set of dealers, another group of buyers who value possession over preservation. The best we can do is make it harder, make the penalties severe enough to matter, and educate enough people about why this is theft, not just commerce." Back at the farm that evening, James and Max unloaded the carefully crated artifacts. Carrying them into the underground chamber felt like returning something stolen, which of course it was. Max handled each crate with reverence that would have seemed impossible months ago. His transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It happened through the accumulation of small moments. Small choices, showing up, doing the work, gradually becoming someone different than the man who'd tried to sell off his father's legacy. One of the recovered pieces was a ceremonial cutting tool. Dar Running Bear handled it with special care, her hands trembling slightly. This was believed lost during the relocations of the 1800s. Her voice was barely above whisper. Our oral histories describe it, the songs mention it, but we thought it was gone forever. She looked at James. Items like this aren't just artifacts. They're sacred objects. The tribal council will need to determine whether it stays here or is repatriated for ceremonial use. Over the following weeks, the recovery efforts continued bearing fruit. Other collectors, hearing about Whitaker's cooperation and the strength of the evidence, began reaching out. Some wanted to avoid prosecution. Others seemed genuinely disturbed to learn they possessed stolen property. By late January, 27 of the identified 30 missing items had been recovered or were in process of return. The remaining 3 had been sold to international buyers beyond the reach of U.S. law. Their loss was permanent. Rather than hide these losses, Dr. Running Bear insisted on acknowledging them openly in the museum design. Empty display cases with explanatory text about the missing items and the ongoing challenges of cultural heritage protection. These gaps serve a purpose, she explained. They remind visitors that preservation is active, ongoing work, that what's lost can't always be recovered, that vigilance matters. The district attorney's office scheduled Max's sentencing for late January. The drive to the county courthouse was quiet. James drove while Max stared out at frozen fields, lost in thought. I keep wondering what Dad would say. Max spoke finally about all of this, the theft, the recovery, the museum plans. James considered that. I think he'd say that falling down doesn't define you, getting back up does. The courtroom was small and utilitarian. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the file while Max stood before her. James sat in the gallery, Dr. Running Bear beside him. Mr. Reed, the judge began, you've pleaded guilty to theft of cultural property. You've cooperated fully with federal investigators. Her eyes lifted from the papers. Dr. Running Bear has submitted a letter on your behalf, as has your nephew. The tribal council has requested leniency. She paused. Why should I show you mercy? Max stood straighter. You shouldn't, Your Honor. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong even while I was doing it. His voice was steady. But my father spent his life trying to do something right, and I almost destroyed it out of greed and spite. He took a breath. If you give me the chance, I'd like to spend whatever time I have left trying to finish what he started, to honor what I nearly ruined. The judge studied him for what felt like a long time. The silence in the courtroom was complete. 2 years probation, 500 hours community service, to be served at the Reed Family Museum under supervision of Dr. Running Bear. She leaned forward slightly. Don't thank me, Mr. Reed. Thank the people whose heritage you almost sold, and spend the rest of your life earning back their trust. Outside the courthouse, Max stood in weak winter sunlight, looking dazed. I thought for sure prison time. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. You got a second chance. Make it count. They drove back to the farm in better spirits. The probation and community service were serious commitments, but they were manageable. Max would have the opportunity to be part of the museum project legitimately, to contribute rather than undermine. That evening, Walter Schuyler called. He'd heard about the sentencing and wanted to speak with Max directly. James handed over the phone and stepped outside, giving them privacy. When Max emerged 30 minutes later, his eyes were red, but his shoulders seemed lighter. He said, making amends isn't something you finish. Max's voice was rough. It's something you live every day, every choice, every action. He said he believes I'll make the right choices going forward. Will you? Max looked out at the darkened fields, the barns standing solid in the distance. I'm going to try with everything I have. That's all I can promise. It was enough. As winter gave way to early spring, grant applications began bearing fruit. The tribal council approved significant funding for educational programming. A regional foundation committed resources for exhibition development. The State Historical Society provided matching funds for preservation work. Slowly, the financial pieces were falling into place. But funding wasn't the only challenge. The barn renovation required permits from multiple agencies. The State Historic Preservation Office, the County Building Department, environmental regulators concerned about soil disturbance, each one with its own requirements and timeline. James spent frustrating weeks on phone calls and paperwork, documenting why every proposed change was necessary and how it would be done respectfully. The bureaucracy felt suffocating at times, but he learned to navigate it, learned who to call when applications stalled, learned how to frame requests in language that satisfied regulatory concerns. Max proved invaluable in these negotiations. His decades of dealing with agricultural agencies had taught him how bureaucracies worked, how to be persistent without being antagonistic, how to build relationships with inspectors and regulators that made future approvals easier. One afternoon, they were reviewing architectural plans with a state preservation officer who had concerns about modifications to the barn's interior. Max walked her through the proposed changes, explaining how each one preserved the building's character while enabling its new function. His practical knowledge and obvious respect for the structure convinced her in ways James's more academic arguments hadn't. After she left, approving the plans with minor modifications, Dr. Running Bear smiled. "Your uncle has skills we need," she told James. "He knows how to talk to people who work with their hands and follow rules. That's not a small thing." In March, a crisis emerged that threatened to derail the entire timeline. During routine inspection of the underground chamber's environmental systems, an HVAC specialist discovered signs of water infiltration in the concrete walls. Not immediate disaster, but concerning. If not addressed properly, moisture could damage artifacts over time. The repair required expertise beyond what local contractors possessed. They needed specialists in museum-grade climate control for subterranean spaces. The search led them to a firm in Indianapolis that handled installations at major museums. The specialist who visited was a man named Richard Chen, late 40s, with 20 years of experience. He spent 2 days examining the chamber, running tests, studying how water moved through the soil around the structure. Max spent those 2 days with him, discussing drainage patterns, explaining how water behaved on this property in different seasons, offering insights from 40 years of managing this specific land. Chen listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking questions that showed he respected Max's knowledge. At the end of the second day, Chen delivered his assessment. The infiltration is coming from a spring that runs underground about 15 feet west of the chamber. During heavy rain, it gets more active and pushes water through fissures in the concrete. He looked at Max. "Your uncle's observations about seasonal washer patterns match what my testing shows. The solution needs to account for those patterns or it won't work long term." The repair would be expensive, more than the contingency budget allowed. Dr. Running Bear worked connections to secure emergency funding from the tribal nation in a private foundation. The work would delay construction by 6 weeks, but it was essential. Max was in the chamber daily during the repairs, consulting with Chen's crew, offering suggestions drawn from deep familiarity with the land. James watched his uncle finding new purpose in contributing his expertise, being valued for knowledge he'd accumulated over decades. One evening, Max and James stood in the chamber after the crew had left. The repairs were nearly complete. New drainage systems, improved waterproofing, state-of-the-art climate control. "Your grandfather would be proud," Max said, looking at the upgraded systems. "Not just that it's getting done, but how, with the right people doing it right." He turned to James. "I spent so many years thinking this place was just dirt and plants. That farming was the only thing that mattered here." He gestured at the artifacts lining the walls. "I couldn't see that the land holds stories, that our work is part of something bigger than crop yields and profit margins. You see it now. That's what matters." Max nodded. "Yeah, I just wish I'd seen it sooner. While there was still time to tell Dad I understood." In April, as the weather finally warmed and construction resumed in earnest, Walter Schuyler visited unannounced. James found him standing by the old oak tree, looking out at the fields beginning to green. "Walk with me," Walter said simply. They walked in silence for a time. James had learned that elders often taught through observation and presence, rather than direct instruction. That wisdom required patience to receive. "Your grandfather understood something most people never learn," Walter said eventually. "That ownership is temporary. We are all temporary, but the land endures, and the responsibility to care for it passes from hand to hand like a sacred bundle." He stopped at the creek marking the eastern boundary. "This water has flowed here for thousands of years. My ancestors drank from it. Your ancestors drank from it. Your children and mine will drink from it if we protect it properly." James waited, sensing there was more. "Your uncle made serious mistakes," Walter continued, "but he's working to correct them. That matters more than the mistakes themselves. The council sees his efforts. We believe in second chances for those who earn them through action, not just words. He paused. We also see your efforts. The way you honor your grandfather's work while creating something new. The way you listen to our concerns and incorporate our guidance into your plans. Partnership isn't always easy, but it's necessary. James felt the weight of evaluation, the recognition that he was being tested not just on competence but on character, whether he could be trusted with something sacred. I want to do this right, James said, not just for my family's legacy but for all the families whose stories this place holds. Walter nodded. Wanting is the beginning. Doing is the test. Time will reveal whether you have strength to continue when things get difficult, because they will get difficult. That's guaranteed. They walked back toward the farmhouse. Before leaving, Walter placed a hand on James's shoulder. Your grandfather saw something in you, something you're just beginning to see in yourself. Don't disappoint him. More importantly, don't disappoint yourself. After he left, James stood on the porch watching the truck disappear down the drive. The responsibility felt enormous, the stakes higher than anything he'd undertaken before. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, James felt equal to what was being asked. Not because the work was easy, but because it connected him to something larger than himself. By late spring, the barn renovation was in full swing. Contractors swarmed the site. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Trucks delivered materials. The farm that had been so quiet through winter suddenly thrummed with purpose and activity. James established a rhythm, mornings with contractors, reviewing progress, solving problems as they arose. Afternoons with Dr. Running Bear's team, continuing exhibition design and artifact documentation. Evenings at the kitchen table, working on grant reports and donor communications. Max worked alongside the construction crew when his skills were relevant. He also began developing curriculum for the agricultural education programming. Working with the Tribal Council's education coordinator, he outlined demonstrations of traditional farming methods, plowing techniques, crop rotation, tool use and maintenance. One afternoon, James found Max teaching a group of tribal youth how to use a hand plow. The old implement that would eventually be displayed in the agricultural section had been brought out for practice. Max walked them through the technique patiently. You can't force it, his voice carried across the yard. Feel how the blade wants to move through the soil. Work with the land, not against it. The teenagers struggled at first, fighting the plow. Then one of them, a tall, lanky kid, maybe 15, found the rhythm. His face lit up with understanding as the blade suddenly moved smoothly. There you go. Max clapped his shoulder. That's it exactly. James watched from a distance, seeing his uncle transformed. This was healing work. For Max and for the kids learning from him. Knowledge passing between generations. Connections being rebuilt. As summer approached, the barn's transformation became visible. The exterior restored to its original appearance, but with modern waterproofing and structural reinforcement hidden beneath historic boards. The roof newly shingled. The foundation sound. Inside, the change was more dramatic. The upper level maintained its agricultural character while serving as gallery space. Display cases positioned carefully. Interpretive panels explaining farming history and indigenous agricultural practices. Interactive elements where visitors could touch replica tools. The new stairway descended gradually along the north wall, creating a physical transition from present to past. Changing light and temperature as visitors moved deeper, a journey that prepared them for what lay below. The underground chamber had been upgraded with state-of-the-art systems while preserving the space Raymond had created. Display cases positioned to guide visitors chronologically and thematically, each artifact properly labeled in both English and Oneida. The empty spaces remained, placeholders for what couldn't be recovered, reminders of ongoing challenges. Standing in the completed space one evening after the workers had left, James felt his grandfather's presence strongly. 6 months of intensive work. Longer if you counted from his arrival at the farm. An inheritance he hadn't wanted had become a calling he couldn't imagine abandoning. Max descended the stairs slowly, taking in the finished exhibition. He moved from display to display, reading labels, examining artifacts he'd once tried to sell. He would have loved this. Max's voice echoed slightly. All those years working alone, dreaming about what it could become. And here it is. James couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. You know what I think would matter most to him? Max continued. Not just that it exists, but how it exists. The partnerships, the respect for multiple perspectives, the commitment to getting it right, even when that meant going slower and working harder. He turned to James. That's his real legacy, not the artifacts, but the example of how to be a proper steward. They stood together in the space Raymond Reed had built and hidden and preserved for 30 years. The space that would now share its secrets with the world. Multiple histories acknowledged and honored. Different people's relationships with the same land given equal voice and respect. The work wasn't finished. Opening day still lay ahead. Staff to train, final details to perfect, 1,000 last-minute adjustments required. But the foundation was complete. The structure sound, the vision realized in concrete, in wood, and carefully preserved memory. Outside, the summer sun set over fields ready for harvest. Inside, the museum prepared to fulfill its purpose. And somewhere beyond sight or sound, Raymond Reed's spirit perhaps rested easier, knowing his life's work would endure and evolve beyond anything he could have imagined. James and Max turned off the lights and secured the building, walking back to the farmhouse together. Two men bound by blood and failure and slowly rebuilt trust, both carrying forward a legacy neither had chosen but both now embraced completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, opening preparations intensifying, more details requiring attention, more decisions to make. But tonight they could rest knowing the hardest work was done, the partnerships genuine, the purpose clear, the promise about to be kept. In the morning, the final push toward opening day would begin. But for now, in this moment, they allowed themselves satisfaction. Hard-earned, well-deserved. The kind that comes only from seeing difficult work through to completion with integrity intact and relationships strengthened. The land that had tested them now offered rest. The barn that had held secrets now stood ready to share them. And the two men who had almost destroyed everything walked side by side toward home, knowing they'd built something that would outlast them both. August arrived with heat that reminded James why his grandfather had planted specific crops in specific fields. The corn stood tall, rustling in the hot wind. The soybeans spread green across the western 40 acres. The land knew what it was doing even when the people working it sometimes forgot. 4 weeks until the opening ceremony. 28 days to finalize everything that had been building for the better part of a year. James woke most mornings with his mind already running through checklists. Staff training, marketing materials, guest coordination, security protocols, insurance, parking, restrooms, the 1,000 details that separated a successful public opening from a disaster. Dr. Running Bear arrived early most days, her SUV kicking up dust on the drive. She'd become more than a partner in the project. She'd become something like family, the kind of family you choose through shared work and mutual respect rather than accident of birth. One morning, she found James in the barn, staring at a display that wasn't quite right. The flow felt wrong. Visitors would move through too quickly, miss the connections he was trying to show. "You're overthinking it," she said, reading his frustration. "Sometimes simpler is better. But I want them to understand how everything connects. The indigenous agricultural practices to European farming techniques to contemporary sustainable agriculture. It's all related. Then tell them that directly." She gestured at the space. "Don't make them guess. Trust that they came here to learn." James reworked the interpretive panel, simplifying the language, making the connections explicit. When he showed her the revision, she nodded approval. Better. Now they'll actually read it instead of just walking past. Outside, Max was working with a crew from the tribal nation to create a gathering circle in the clearing between the barn and the oak tree. Traditional design, Walter Schuyler had specified, the circle representing continuity, the eternal return of seasons and generations. James watched them work from the barn doorway. Max moving more slowly than the younger men, but with confidence born of knowing this land intimately. He'd measure, adjust, measure again. Getting it right mattered more than getting it done quickly. One of the tribal workers, a man maybe 30, asked Max about something. They talked for several minutes, Max sketching in the dirt with a stick, the younger man nodding. Then they continued work with adjusted approach. This was what partnership looked like. Not just agreeing to work together, but actually listening to each other. Adjusting based on different knowledge and perspectives. Building something neither could have built alone. The staff training intensified in mid-August. James had hired a small team, a museum director with experience at similar institutions, an education coordinator to manage school programs, 4 docents who would lead tours and answer questions, all of them needing to understand not just facts, but the spirit of what they were presenting. The training sessions ran long, James and Dr. Running Bear tag-teaming the instruction, covering the collection's history, proper handling procedures, indigenous cultural protocols, how to respectfully discuss difficult topics like theft and repatriation. One session focused on handling challenging visitors. What if someone questioned whether artifacts found on private land really belonged to indigenous peoples? What if they brought dismissive attitudes about Native American culture? Answer with facts and humanity both. Dr. Running Bear advised. Explain the legal frameworks around cultural property, but also help them understand these aren't abstract issues. Every artifact represents someone's ancestor, someone's grandmother's skill, someone's grandfather's prayers. The staff absorbed this seriously. James could see them wrestling with complexity. Understanding this work required more than memorizing display labels. It required empathy and thoughtfulness and willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths. Sarah, one of the docents, raised her hand. What if visitors get defensive, feel like they're being accused of something? Then remind them this isn't about assigning blame to individuals. Dr. Running Bear's voice was patient. It's about acknowledging history honestly so we can build something better. Most people respond well to that if you present it without judgment. 2 weeks before opening, disaster arrived on thunderstorm winds. James woke to the sound of something crashing. He reached the window in time to see shingles tearing off the barn roof, spinning away into darkness. Rain followed immediately, heavy and driving. He was out the door pulling on boots and jacket. Max emerged from his room doing the same. They ran through the downpour to the barn. Inside, water poured through gaps in the roof. The upper gallery was flooding. Display cases stood in spreading pools. Interpretive panels soaked through. James felt his stomach drop. Weeks of work potentially destroyed. Max was already moving. We need tarps, lots of them. Move what we can. Cover what we can't. They worked through the night, dragging tarps from the equipment shed, covering displays, moving artifacts to the underground chamber where they'd be safe. Dr. Running Bear arrived at dawn with her team and additional supplies. By sunrise, they had the immediate damage controlled. The artifacts themselves were safe. The cases had protected them. But panels were ruined. Walls needed repainting. The roof needed emergency repair. James stood dripping in the barn, exhausted and fighting despair. We open in 2 weeks. Max surveyed the damage with contractor's eyes. Could be worse. We've got time if we move fast. He made calls. By noon, a crew was working on the roof, installing proper waterproofing that should have been there initially. By evening, they had assessment of all damaged materials. A week of hard work would get them back on schedule. The next 5 days were brutal. Crews working 12-hour shifts. James and Max alongside them doing whatever needed doing. Hauling materials, cleaning, helping with repairs. Dr. Running Bear coordinating with her team to recreate damaged interpretive materials. The physical labor felt good despite exhaustion. James remembered his grandfather saying there was honor in any work done well. That swinging a hammer with care mattered as much as making decisions in an office. On the 5th day, they discovered a blessing hidden in the disaster. While repairing water damage, they found weaknesses in the barn structure that would have caused problems later. Minor but significant, the emergency repairs caught them early. Dr. Running Bear smiled tiredly when James pointed this out. Sometimes difficulties are gifts. They force us to pay attention to what we might have missed. By the end of the week, the barn looked better than before. Fresh paint, upgraded roof, displays repositioned slightly, but improved. The near disaster had strengthened rather than weakened the project. The final week brought different intensity, last-minute details and adjustments. The guest list had grown beyond initial expectations. Over 200 people confirmed. Tribal council members and families, local officials, representatives from museums across the region, farmers and townspeople who remembered Raymond, media outlets interested in the recovery story. They borrowed chairs from churches, rented sound system, brought in portable restrooms, set up parking areas in far fields. The logistics were complex but manageable. James barely slept the last 3 nights. His mind wouldn't stop running through everything that could go wrong. Weather, equipment failure, someone saying something inappropriate. the burden of public presentation after months of private work. Max found him at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, 2 days before opening. You're going to wear yourself out. I keep thinking about what could go wrong. Max poured coffee for both of them and sat down. Here's what I learned about worry. It doesn't prevent bad things from happening. It just stops you from being ready when they do. He looked at his nephew in the lamplight. You've done good work here, real good work. Whatever happens on opening day, that doesn't change. The museum exists. The partnerships are real. The artifacts are protected. That's what matters. What if people don't understand what we're trying to do? Then we'll explain it better. We'll keep trying. That's all anyone can do. There was hard-earned wisdom in his voice. Max had learned about failure and recovery, about falling down and getting back up. His mistakes had taught him humility and persistence. Your grandfather would be proud of you, Max said quietly. Not just for finishing this, but for how you did it. With respect, with partnership, the right way even when it was harder. I hope so, James managed. I really hope so. The morning of the opening ceremony arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, comfortable temperature, enough breeze to move air but not scatter papers. If you believed in signs, this was a good one. James dressed carefully, slacks and button-down shirt, boots that could handle walking the property. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone different than the man who'd arrived here 10 months ago. The defeated city dweller replaced by someone who knew his purpose and place. Downstairs, Max was waiting, dressed in clean work clothes and his best boots. He'd been up since before dawn, walking the property one last time, making sure everything was ready. Ready? Max asked. James took a breath. Ready. They walked to the barn together, where Dr. Running Bear and her team were making final preparations. Tribal members had arrived early for the blessing ceremony. Walter Schuyler and 4 other elders would consecrate the space according to traditional protocols. James stood back, understanding this part wasn't his to direct. He watched as sage was burned, as prayers were offered in Oneida, as the elders moved through both the barn and underground chamber, acknowledging ancestors whose presence remained in the artifacts and in the land itself. The prayers lasted nearly an hour. When they finished, Walter approached James and Max. The space is ready. The ancestors have been honored. Now we invite the living to witness and learn. Guests began arriving around 10, cars filling the parking areas, people walking up the gravel drive toward the barn and gathering circle. James greeted people at the entrance, shaking hands, accepting congratulations that felt premature. The real test would be whether this place fulfilled its purpose in the months and years ahead. Mrs. Garcia arrived with a group from town. She hugged James fiercely. Your grandfather would burst with pride. All these people coming together because of what he started. Bill Henderson came with his family. He pulled James aside briefly. I owe you an apology. I defended my brother when I should have asked harder questions. I'm grateful you found a way to make this right. Agent Calloway attended in civilian clothes, no longer official, but invested in the project's success. Dr. Running Bear introduced him to tribal council members, explaining his role in the recovery work. At 11, the ceremony began. People gathered in the circle that had been prepared. Sun warm but not oppressive. Birds singing. The barn standing renewed behind them. Walter Schuyler spoke first, in Oneida, then English. He talked about the land's memory, about how stories persist across generations even when the people who first told them are gone, about responsibility to remember truthfully, to honor what came before while building what comes next. Dr. Running Bear spoke about Raymond Reed's unusual dedication to preserving cultural heritage that wasn't his own by birth, about his understanding that the artifacts he found were not his to possess, but his to protect. She called James forward. He'd prepared remarks, but standing there, looking at faces gathered in the circle, the written words felt inadequate. He folded the paper and spoke from his heart. My grandfather taught me something I didn't understand until recently. He gestured toward the barn, the fields beyond. That the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. Everything here, these artifacts and stories, they're not possessions. They're responsibilities. He found Max in the crowd. My uncle and I both had to learn that lesson the hard way. But we learned it, and now we're trying to build something that honors what my grandfather understood. That this place holds multiple histories. That all of them matter. That our job is to be good stewards for the time we're here, knowing others will come after us. Silence followed his words. Then applause, genuine and sustained. James felt his throat tighten. This was real. The dream his grandfather had worked toward for 30 years was being realized. Max spoke next, his voice rough but steady. I made mistakes that nearly destroyed what my father built. The artifacts I sold weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of someone's history, someone's heritage. He looked directly at Walter Schuyler and the other elders. I'm grateful for the chance to make amends, to spend whatever time I have left helping to preserve what I almost lost, to teach young people the skills my father taught me, to be part of something that matters more than my own pride or profit. The tribal council members nodded acknowledgement, forgiveness earned through consistent action rather than empty words. The ribbon cutting was joint effort. James, Max, Dr. Running Bear, and Walter Schuyler held the scissors together. When the ribbon fell, a cheer went up from the crowd. The Reed Family Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum was officially open. Visitors toured in groups, some heading to the upper gallery to see agricultural displays, others descending immediately to the underground chamber. James moved through the spaces, watching reactions, seeing people pause before displays, reading interpretive panels carefully, asking docents thoughtful questions. In the underground chamber, he found an elderly Oneida woman standing before a pottery display, tears streaming down her face. She spoke to Dr. Running Bear in their language, gesturing to a particular vessel with distinctive decorative patterns. Dr. Running Bear translated, her own voice thick with emotion. She says her grandmother made pottery like this. She remembers watching her as a child, learning the patterns and songs that accompanied the work. She thought that knowledge was lost. Her own children never learned. But seeing these pieces preserved, knowing the patterns still exist, maybe it's not too late to remember. Maybe she can still teach her grandchildren. James felt his own eyes sting. This was why the work mattered. Not abstract preservation, but keeping connections alive between past and present, between the dead and the living, between what was and what still could be. The ceremony continued through the afternoon. Demonstrations of traditional crafts, Max showing farming techniques to rapt audiences, tribal storytellers sharing oral histories, food from both indigenous and European traditions shared communally. As evening approached and guests began to leave, James found himself exhausted but deeply satisfied. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But this phase had been completed successfully. The foundation laid, the partnerships established, the promise made and kept. He stood in the gathering circle as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Dr. Running Bear approached with 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to James. "You did good work here," she said simply. "Your grandfather would be proud." "We're not done," James replied. "This is just the beginning. The best work never is done." She smiled. "That's what makes it worthwhile. That's what makes it matter." Max joined them, moving slowly, feeling his age after the long day. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Walter Schuyler was the last guest to leave. He shook James's hand with both of his own, holding it firmly. "You have honored your grandfather's vision. More than that, you have created something that serves the living, not just the dead. That is the highest form of stewardship." He turned to Max. "And you have walked a difficult path with dignity. There is no shame in falling, only in refusing to rise again. You rose. You did the work. That matters more than the mistakes that came before." After he left, James and Max walked through the museum one final time, turning off lights, checking locks, ensuring everything was secure for the night. In the underground chamber, they paused, surrounded by artifacts that had brought them here. "9 months ago, I came to this farm thinking it was an ending." James spoke into the quiet. "My life in Boston had failed. I had nowhere else to go. I thought inheriting this place was just one more loss." Max nodded. "And I thought it was my chance to finally cash out, to escape the burden of a farm I could never make profitable, to get something for myself after years of feeling overlooked." "We were both wrong," James said. "Yeah," Max agreed. "We were both wrong about what matters, about what lasts, about what's worth protecting." They climbed the stairs together, emerging into the barn's upper gallery. The displays gleamed softly in security lighting. Outside, the farm stretched into darkness, the same land that had supported life for over 1,000 years. "You think we can keep this going?" Max asked. "Really make it work long term?" James considered seriously. "I think we have to try. That's what stewardship means. Not just starting something, but seeing it through, year after year." generation after generation. Max clapped his shoulder. Then I guess we better get some sleep. Tomorrow the real work begins. They locked the museum and walked to the farmhouse together. Two men who had been strangers, then adversaries, now partners in shared mission. The lights they'd left on welcomed them home. Inside, James sat at the kitchen table one last time before bed. He pulled out the letter his grandfather had left him, the one that had started this entire journey. He read it again, understanding now depths he'd missed before. What lies beneath supports what stands above. The artifacts beneath the barn floor supporting the museum above. The indigenous history beneath the surface supporting the contemporary community above. The foundation Raymond had built supporting everything that came after. The hard lessons learned supporting the better choices made now. And James himself, the failures and losses that had brought him here supporting the purpose he'd found. The man he'd been supporting, the man he was becoming. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work of keeping the museum running, managing relationships, staying true to the vision while adapting to changing needs. But tonight he could rest, knowing the foundation was solid. Outside, the wind moved through the corn stalks with sound like rushing water. The same wind that had blown across this land for countless generations. The same land that would outlast all of them, bearing witness to their efforts and choices. In the barn museum, surrounded by artifacts and stories, the past and present existed together. Not in conflict, but in conversation. And in that conversation, if you listened carefully, you could hear Raymond Reed's voice still teaching, still guiding, still reminding those who came after that some things are worth preserving. That stewardship matters, that we belong to the land far more than it belongs to us. James climbed the stairs to bed, tired but content. The museum was open. The work continued. And somewhere in the night, he imagined his grandfather smiling. Not at perfection achieved, but at honest effort sustained. At hard lessons learned and better choices made. At two men who had almost destroyed everything now standing together to protect it. That was enough. That was everything. The land that had tested them now offered rest. The barn that had held secrets now stood ready to share them properly. The artifacts that had nearly been scattered across private collections now remained together, their stories intact, their meaning preserved. And in the morning, when visitors returned to walk through displays and learn from guides and touch replica tools and hear stories both ancient and new, the work Raymond Reed had begun would continue. Not unchanged, not frozen in time, but alive and growing and serving purposes he could only have imagined. That was the gift, that was the legacy. Not objects preserved, but relationships renewed. Not possessions hoarded, but responsibilities shared. Not endings, but new beginnings built on foundation of hard-earned wisdom and honest acknowledgement of past failures. James Reed slept deeply that night, dreamless and content, while the land that had claimed him breathed quietly under stars that had witnessed everything and forgotten nothing. In the morning, the work would continue, but tonight in this moment, it was enough to have kept the promise, to have honored the trust, to have built something worthy of the name it carried. The Reed Family Agricultural and Cultural Heritage Museum, a testament to one man's vision, a product of many hands working together, a bridge between past and present and future. A small victory in the long fight to remember truthfully and preserve carefully and pass forward responsibly. It was enough, it was everything, and it was just beginning.